Money can't buy class, but it sure can rent a ballroom. What happens when a rough-around-the-edges rancher decides to shake up high society by bringing his hard-working maid as his date to the most exclusive charity gala in Texas? Some stories start with a laugh and end with a lesson that changes everything. This is one of those stories where prejudice meets pride, where assumptions crumble like a house of cards, and where the biggest surprise isn't who shows up to the dance, but who walks away transformed. Jake Morrison stood 6 feet tall in his worn leather boots, surveying his sprawling ranch from the porch of his mansion. The house seemed almost comical against the backdrop of cattle pastures and oil derricks, a marble monument to new money planted in the middle of genuine Texas dirt. Jake had built his fortune the hard way, starting with a single oil well and a prayer, but now owned half the mineral rights in Brewster County. The invitation lay crumpled on his mahogany desk inside, gold-embossed lettering announcing the annual Bluebonnet Charity Gala. Every year, the cream of Texas high society gathered in Dallas to raise money for various causes while showing off their finest jewels and most expensive gowns. Jake had attended twice before, both times leaving early after enduring countless conversations about wine vintages and European vacations. Maria Santos had worked for Jake for 3 years, keeping his massive house spotless and his meals ready. She moved through the rooms like a ghost, efficient and quiet, with calloused hands that spoke of years of hard work. At 28, she supported her elderly mother and younger sister back in Mexico, sending most of her earnings home while living in the small apartment above Jake's garage. Jake noticed things about Maria that others might miss. How she hummed old Mexican ballads while dusting the library. How she always left fresh wildflowers on his dining table, picked from the fields during her morning walks. How she had taught herself English by reading his discarded newspapers, her vocabulary growing more sophisticated each month. The idea struck him on a Tuesday morning while Maria served his coffee. She had mentioned reading about the charity gala in the society pages, wondering aloud what it would be like to wear such beautiful dresses and eat food prepared by famous chefs. Maria, Jake said suddenly, startling her as she wiped down the kitchen counter. How would you like to go to a fancy party? She looked at him with confusion, her dark eyes searching his face for signs he might be joking. Senor Jake, I don't understand. The Bluebonnet Gala. This Saturday. Black tie, fancy dinner, dancing. He leaned against the doorframe, his weathered hands wrapped around the coffee mug she had given him. I need a date, and, frankly, you're the most interesting person I know. Maria set down her cleaning cloth, her face flushing. You want me to be your date? To a party with rich people? Why not? You work harder than any of those society ladies. You're smarter than most of them too. Besides, it might be fun to shake things up a bit. The proposal terrified and thrilled Maria in equal measure. She had watched such events on television, admiring the glamour while knowing it existed in a world completely separate from her own. The idea of stepping into that world, even for one night, felt like reaching for the stars. But, Senor Jake, I have nothing to wear. I don't know how to act at such places. These people, they will know I don't belong. Jake waved his hand dismissively. Money talks louder than manners in Texas, trust me. And, as for clothes, we'll figure that out. My credit card and a good shopping trip can solve most problems. That afternoon, Jake drove Maria to Neiman Marcus in his pickup truck, drawing curious stares from the valet as they pulled up between BMWs and Mercedes. Maria clutched her purse tightly, overwhelmed by the marble floors and crystal chandeliers that seemed to cost more than she earned in a year. The personal shopper, a polished woman named Catherine, initially assumed Maria was Jake's translator or assistant. When Jake explained the situation, Catherine's professional smile never wavered, but her eyes revealed her surprise. Of course, Mr. Morrison. We'll find something perfect for your companion. The trying-on process felt like torture to Maria. Each dress cost more than she sent home to her family in 6 months. When she emerged from the dressing room in a midnight blue gown that hugged her curves perfectly, even Catherine seemed genuinely impressed. Stunning, the woman admitted, and Maria caught a glimpse of herself in the three-way mirror. For a moment, she didn't recognize the elegant woman looking back at her. Jake's reaction was worth every uncomfortable moment. His usually gruff expression softened, and he whistled low under his breath. Maria, you look like $1,000,000. They spent the rest of the afternoon on accessories, shoes, and a quick trip to a salon where Maria's long black hair was styled into an elegant updo. Jake watched the transformation with growing admiration, realizing he had always seen Maria's beauty but never understood how extraordinary she truly was. As Saturday evening approached, Jake found himself more nervous than he had ever been about a social event. He had attended business dinners with oil executives and politicians, but somehow this felt different. This felt important in a way he couldn't quite explain. Maria spent the day of the gala in a state of barely controlled panic. She practiced walking in her heels, studied etiquette videos online, and rehearsed conversations in front of her bathroom mirror. Her sister called from Mexico, squealing with excitement when Maria described the dress. "Mija, you will be the most beautiful woman there," her sister said. "Don't let anyone make you feel small. You have just as much right to be there as anyone." When Jake arrived at Maria's apartment to pick her up, he wore his finest tuxedo and carried a small corsage of white orchids. Maria opened the door, and, for a moment, neither of them spoke. The transformation was complete. Maria moved with new confidence, her posture straight and elegant. The dress flowed around her like water, and her eyes sparkled with nervous excitement. "Ready to crash a party?" Jake asked, offering his arm. "Ready as I'll ever be," Maria replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. The drive to Dallas took 2 hours, filled with comfortable conversation and shared nervousness. Jake found himself telling Maria stories about his early days in the oil business, how he had been laughed out of banks and country clubs before striking it rich. Maria shared memories of her childhood in Mexico, painting pictures of family celebrations and traditions that made Jake laugh. As they pulled up to the Adolphus Hotel, where the gala was being held, Maria's confidence wavered slightly. Luxury cars lined the circular drive, and women in glittering gowns stepped carefully from limousines. Every person looked like they had stepped from the pages of a magazine. "Remember," Jake said, squeezing her hand gently, "half these people inherited their money and never worked a day in their lives. You've got more substance in your little finger than they have in their whole bodies." The hotel lobby buzzed with pre-party energy. Groups of elegantly dressed guests chatted and posed for photographers, their laughter echoing off the ornate ceiling. Jake and Maria made their way toward the ballroom, and already heads were beginning to turn. Maria held her head high, channeling every lesson her grandmother had taught her about dignity and grace. She belonged here tonight, not because of the expensive dress or the jewelry Jake had insisted on buying, but because she was a human being deserving of respect and consideration. The ballroom doors opened before them, revealing a wonderland of crystal and gold. Round tables draped in white linen surrounded a dance floor that reflected the light from 3 massive chandeliers. The guest list read like a who's who of Texas society: oil barons, tech entrepreneurs, political figures, and old money families whose names graced hospital wings and university buildings. As Jake and Maria entered the ballroom, conversations began to quiet. Eyes followed their progress across the room, whispers starting like ripples on a pond. Some guests recognized Jake from business dealings or previous charitable events, but no one recognized the stunning woman on his arm. "Jake Morrison," called a voice from their left. Richard Pemberton, heir to a shipping fortune, approached with his wife Eleanor in tow. "Good to see you again. And who is this lovely lady?" Jake felt Maria tense slightly beside him, but her smile never wavered. "Richard, Eleanor, I'd like you to meet Maria Santos." "Maria, these are the Pembertons." Eleanor's eyes traveled up and down Maria's form with the practiced assessment of a woman accustomed to evaluating social hierarchies through clothing and accessories. "Charming," she said, though her tone suggested anything but charm. "And how do you and Jake know each other, dear?" Maria's response came without hesitation, delivered in perfectly clear English with just a hint of her musical accent. "Jake and I have known each other for several years. We share similar interests in literature and philanthropy." It wasn't exactly a lie, though it wasn't the complete truth either. Maria did read voraciously, often discussing books with Jake during their conversations. And she had always admired his charitable giving, even suggesting worthy causes from her own community. Richard raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued by this unexpected answer. Literature, you say? What have you been reading lately? I just finished Garcia Marquez's latest work, Maria replied smoothly. His use of magical realism continues to evolve in fascinating ways. Though I must say, I prefer his earlier, more politically charged pieces. Eleanor's carefully composed expression faltered slightly. She had expected small talk about fashion or weather, not a literary discussion that she was unprepared to join. The evening was off to an interesting start. The cocktail hour continued with Maria navigating conversations like a skilled diplomat. Her natural intelligence and genuine curiosity about people drew others to her, though many approached with barely concealed skepticism. She spoke knowledgeably about current events, asked thoughtful questions about their work and interests, and displayed a warmth that stood in stark contrast to the polite but distant interactions typical of such gatherings. Judge Harold Whitman, a distinguished man in his 70s who sat on the boards of several major charities, found himself genuinely charmed by Maria's questions about criminal justice reform. You know, my dear, most people at these events ask me about my golf game or my vacation home. But, you're interested in the real work we do. Refreshing, truly refreshing. Margaret Sinclair, widow of a tech fortune and notorious social gatekeeper, proved more challenging. She approached Maria and Jake near the silent auction displays, her eyes glittering with predatory interest. Mr. Morrison, what a surprise to see you here again. And, Miss Santos, is it? Margaret's voice carried the honeyed sweetness that often preceded a verbal attack. That's such an unusual name. Are you from around here originally? Maria recognized the loaded question immediately. In her 3 years of working for wealthy families, she had learned to identify the subtle ways people tried to establish social hierarchies. I was born in Guadalajara, Mrs. Sinclair. My family moved to Texas when I was 12. I consider myself very fortunate to call this state home. How wonderful that you've managed to adapt so well, Margaret replied, her smile sharp as a knife. It must be quite an adjustment, going from Mexico to events like this. Jake's jaw tightened, but Maria placed a gentle hand on his arm before he could respond. Actually, Mrs. Sinclair, the adjustment hasn't been difficult at all. Good manners and kindness translate perfectly across any culture. Though I suppose that's true everywhere except where people choose to forget their humanity. The subtle rebuke landed perfectly. Margaret's smile faltered, and she excused herself quickly, claiming to see someone across the room who needed her attention. Remind me never to get on your bad side, Jake whispered to Maria, his admiration evident. As dinner was announced, guests began finding their assigned tables. Jake had specifically requested a table near the back, preferring to observe rather than be observed, but their assigned seats placed them directly in the center of the ballroom. The table included the Pembertons, Judge Whitman, a prominent oil executive named Charles Bradford and his wife, and 2 empty chairs that remained mysteriously unfilled. The first course arrived with theatrical presentation, tiny portions of exotic ingredients arranged like modern art. Maria watched the other guests to understand which fork to use, though her grandmother's lessons about eating gracefully served her well. The conversation flowed around topics of charity work, political developments, and social events. So Maria, Charles Bradford said during the soup course, Jake mentioned you're interested in philanthropy. Do you work with any particular organizations? Maria set down her spoon carefully. I'm passionate about education access for immigrant families. Many children arrive with incredible potential but lack resources for proper schooling. I've been volunteering with literacy programs when my schedule allows. This was true. Maria had been teaching English to recent immigrants at the local community center, a fact Jake had only recently learned when he overheard her making arrangements over the phone. How admirable, Mrs. Bradford said, though her tone suggested she found it more curious than admirable. And where did you develop this interest? Through your work? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Several conversations at nearby tables had quieted, and Maria realized they had become the evening's entertainment. She looked around the table, seeing expressions ranging from genuine interest to barely concealed amusement. Through my life, Maria replied simply. When you've experienced firsthand the difference that education can make, it becomes impossible to ignore the needs of others facing similar challenges. Judge Whitman nodded approvingly. Personal experience often creates the most effective advocates. Too many charity board members write checks but never understand the real issues. The comment drew uncomfortable glances from several guests who fit exactly that description. Maria began to understand that even within this world of wealth and privilege, there were divides between those who took their responsibilities seriously and those who treated charity as a social obligation. As the main course was served, an elaborate preparation of beef tenderloin that probably cost more than Maria's monthly grocery budget, the conversation turned to more personal territory. "Jake, I have to ask," Eleanor Pemberton said with a laugh that sounded forced, however, "did you two meet? It's such an interesting pairing." The question drew attention from surrounding tables. This was the moment many guests had been waiting for, the revelation of how a rough oilman had ended up with this mysterious, articulate woman who clearly didn't run in their usual circles. Jake met Maria's eyes across the table, and something passed between them, an understanding that this moment would define the rest of their evening and, possibly, their relationship. "We met through work," Jake said simply. "Oh, are you in the oil business as well?" Mrs. Bradford asked Maria. Maria's heart raced, but her voice remained steady. "I work in domestic management. I manage Jake's household staff and oversee the maintenance of his properties." The euphemism was technically accurate while avoiding the harsh reality that she was, essentially, his maid. But Eleanor Pemberton was too socially savvy to miss the implications. "Domestic management," Eleanor repeated slowly, as if tasting the words. "How practical." The temperature at the table seemed to drop several degrees. Margaret Sinclair, who had been circulating among tables during dinner, appeared behind Maria's chair as if summoned by some social scandal radar. "I couldn't help but overhear," Margaret said, her voice carrying farther than necessary. "Did you say domestic management? How fascinating. I'm always interested in meeting people from different walks of life." The condescension in her tone was unmistakable now. Other conversations around them began to quiet as word spread through the subtle communication networks that govern such gatherings. The interesting woman with the oil baron was his employee. His maid. Jake's face darkened, and he started to rise from his chair, but Maria caught his hand under the table. She had faced worse humiliation than this, and she would not allow these people to make her ashamed of honest work. "Yes, Mrs. Sinclair," Maria said, rising gracefully from her chair. "I'm proud to say I've worked hard every day of my life. I take care of one of the most beautiful homes in Texas, ensure that everything runs smoothly, and do it with excellence. Not everyone can say the same about their work." The implication was clear. How many of these people had actually worked for anything they had? Margaret's smile became predatory. "Of course, dear. Though I must say, it's certainly bold of you to attend an event like this. Some might say it's a bit above your station." The comment cut through the air like a blade. Nearby tables fell silent, sensing drama unfolding. Maria felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon her, some sympathetic, others eager for entertainment. But, instead of shrinking, Maria straightened her shoulders and smiled with genuine warmth. "Mrs. Sinclair, I think you might be confused about what determines someone's station in life. Is it the circumstances of their birth? The size of their bank account? Or perhaps it's how they treat other human beings?" She paused, letting the question settle over the increasingly attentive audience. "Because if we're measuring stations by kindness, integrity, and the willingness to work hard for what we believe in, then I'm comfortable with where I stand. The question is, where do you stand?" The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret Sinclair, a woman accustomed to wielding social power like a weapon, found herself completely outmaneuvered by someone she had dismissed as insignificant. Judge Whitman began to clap slowly, his applause gaining momentum until others joined in. "Beautifully said, my dear. Beautifully said." But not everyone was impressed. Charles Bradford stood abruptly, throwing his napkin on the table. "This is ridiculous. Jake, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but bringing your hired help to an event like this is insulting to everyone here." The words hung in the air like a declaration of war. Jake rose to his feet, his eyes blazing, but Maria was faster. "Mr. Bradford," she said, her voice carrying a strength that commanded attention, "you're right that this is insulting. It's insulting that in 2024, there are still people who believe that a person's worth is determined by their job title rather than their character. It's insulting that you think your money makes you a better human being than someone who works with their hands to support their family." She turned to address the entire table, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I clean houses, yes. I scrub floors and wash dishes and make beds. And I do it with pride because it's honest work that allows me to support people I love. What exactly do you do that makes you so superior? Inherit money? Attend meetings about other people's work? Write checks with money you didn't earn?" The ballroom had grown so quiet that Maria's voice carried to tables across the room. She had become the center of everyone's attention, and, instead of shrinking from it, she embraced it. Tonight was supposed to be about raising money for charity, about helping people in need. But all you seem to care about is making sure everyone knows their place in your little hierarchy. Well, let me tell you something about my place. Maria walked around the table as she spoke, her elegant gown flowing behind her, her posture regal despite the circumstances. My place is with people who understand that dignity isn't for sale. My place is with people who measure success by how they lift others up, not by how they tear them down. And if that's not good enough for your party, then this isn't the kind of party I want to attend anyway." Maria's words echoed through the ballroom like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples that spread from table to table. For a moment, the only sound was the gentle clinking of crystal glasses as stunned guests set down their drinks. Then, slowly, something unexpected began to happen. Judge Whitman stood first, his weathered hands clapping steadily. "Magnificent," he said loudly enough for the entire room to hear. "Absolutely magnificent." Dr. Sarah Chen, a prominent surgeon who had been quietly observing from a nearby table, rose next. Her applause was joined by Father Miguel Rodriguez, who ran the city's largest homeless shelter, and, then, by others who understood that real worth couldn't be measured in stock portfolios or trust funds. But the division in the room became stark as roughly half the guests remained seated, their faces reflecting everything from embarrassment to outright hostility. The Bluebonnet Gala had never witnessed such a scene, and no one seemed quite sure how to proceed. Jake moved to Maria's side, his presence solid and reassuring. "I think my date just said everything that needed saying," he announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to commanding oil rigs and business meetings. "And if that's a problem for anyone here, I suggest you examine what you're really upset about." Margaret Sinclair, her face flushed with indignation, stepped forward. "This is outrageous. Security should escort both of you out immediately. This is a private event for invited guests, not a platform for social grandstanding." "Actually, Margaret," came a familiar voice from the ballroom entrance, "they're exactly the kind of people this event should celebrate." All heads turned to see William Carrington III, chairman of the charity board and heir to one of Texas's oldest oil fortunes. At 82, he commanded respect that transcended social politics. He walked slowly but purposefully toward the center of the commotion, his weathered cowboy boots clicking against the marble floor. "I've been standing in the doorway for the last 5 minutes, listening to this young woman speak," Carrington continued, his gravelly voice carrying decades of authority. "And I'll tell you what I heard. I heard more wisdom and genuine character than I've encountered at these gatherings in years." He stopped directly in front of Maria, studying her with eyes that had seen fortunes made and lost, that had witnessed the transformation of Texas from cattle country to oil empire to tech powerhouse. "Miss Santos, is it? I'd like to shake your hand." Maria extended her hand, still trembling slightly from adrenaline, and Carrington took it gently between both of his. "My great-grandmother was a seamstress who took in laundry to support her family," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "My grandfather started with nothing but a pickaxe and a dream. They taught me that honest work is the foundation of everything worthwhile in this world. Your speech tonight reminded me of lessons I should never have forgotten." He turned to address the room, his voice growing stronger. "This gala exists to raise money for programs that help working families, immigrant communities, and people struggling to build better lives. How dare any of us look down on someone who embodies exactly what we claim to support? The rebuke landed like thunder. Several guests shifted uncomfortably, suddenly, fascinated by their dessert plates or the crystal patterns on their water glasses. Charles Bradford, however, wasn't ready to concede defeat. William, with all due respect, there's a difference between supporting working people and the circus. There are proper channels, appropriate venues for social mixing. This event has standards. Standards, Carrington repeated slowly, as if tasting the word. Charles, your grandfather sold bootleg whiskey during Prohibition. Your family's fortune was built on breaking the law. Are those the standards you're referring to? The color drained from Bradford's face as uncomfortable murmurs rippled through the crowd. Everyone knew the Bradford family history, but it was never discussed in polite society. Furthermore, Carrington continued, warming to his theme, I've been watching this room tonight, and I've seen more genuine grace and intelligence from Miss Santos than from half our regular attendees combined. If we're talking about standards, maybe we need to examine what we're actually measuring. Eleanor Pemberton made one last attempt to salvage the social order. But, William, surely you understand the importance of maintaining certain boundaries. Social hierarchies exist for good reasons. People are more comfortable among their own kind. Maria finally spoke again, her voice calm but firm. Mrs. Pemberton, what kind am I, exactly? Because I was born in Mexico, does that make me a different species? Because I clean houses, am I somehow less human? Or is it because I don't have enough money to buy acceptance in your world? She paused, looking around the room at faces that reflected varying degrees of shame, anger, and confusion. I've spent this evening listening to conversations about charity work, about helping underprivileged communities, about making the world a better place. But, the moment you discovered that I actually came from the communities you claim to help, I became the enemy. Do you see the problem with that? Dr. Chen stepped forward from her table. Miss Santos, I wonder if you'd be interested in joining our literacy program board? We need people who understand the challenges facing immigrant families, not just people who can write checks. I'd be honored, Maria replied, surprised by the offer. And, our shelter always needs volunteers who speak Spanish, Father Rodriguez added. Someone with your communication skills could make a real difference. More offers came from around the room, invitations to serve on boards, to volunteer for programs, to share her insights about the communities that many of these organizations claim to serve but rarely truly understood. Jake watched with growing amazement as Maria transformed from an object of curiosity into a sought-after ally. The woman he had known as his capable, intelligent housekeeper was revealing depths he had never fully recognized. But, not everyone was ready to embrace this social revolution. Margaret Sinclair gathered her purse and wrap, her face set in lines of bitter disapproval. This is exactly what's wrong with society today, she announced to no one in particular. Standards don't matter anymore. Tradition means nothing. Soon we'll be inviting just anyone to these events. Margaret, Carrington called after her, when you say just anyone, what exactly do you mean? The question stopped her in her tracks. She turned back, her mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from water, unable to voice the prejudices that her question had revealed. Because if you mean hard-working, intelligent, articulate people who've overcome real challenges to build meaningful lives, then, yes, I hope we'll be inviting many more of them. Margaret left without another word, taking several others with her. The ballroom felt lighter in their absence, as if a storm cloud had passed. Jake found himself seeing the evening and Maria with completely new eyes. He had brought her as a gesture of rebellion against social expectations, never imagining that she would transform the entire dynamic of the gathering. Her courage and dignity had not only defended her own worth but had forced everyone present to examine their own assumptions and prejudices. As the evening wound down, Maria found herself surrounded by people genuinely interested in her perspectives and experiences. Judge Whitman wanted to discuss criminal justice reform with someone who had seen the system from the ground up. Dr. Chen was fascinated by Maria's insights about healthcare access for undocumented workers. Father Rodriguez shared stories about his own family's immigration journey. The charity auction, when it finally resumed, raised more money than any previous gala. Carrington attributed the success to the evening's renewed sense of purpose and authenticity. During the final dance, Jake and Maria swayed together on the dance floor, surrounded by couples but feeling as if they were in their own world. "I owe you an apology," Jake said quietly. Maria looked up at him in surprise. "For what?" "I brought you here thinking it would be funny to shake up these stuffy rich folks. I was using you to make a point about how ridiculous they all are. But you weren't here to be my weapon against their snobbery. You were here as yourself, remarkable, intelligent, dignified, and you turned their prejudice into an opportunity for real change." Maria considered this, her head resting against his shoulder as they moved to the music. "I think we both learned something tonight," she said finally. "You learned that I'm more than just your housekeeper. And I learned that some wealthy people actually care about using their privilege responsibly." "What happens now?" Jake asked. "Now we go home," Maria said simply. "Tomorrow, I'll still clean your house and you'll still run your business. But maybe we'll both do it with a better understanding of who we really are." As they drove back to the ranch in comfortable silence, both Jake and Maria reflected on the evening's events. The laughter that had initially greeted their arrival had indeed not lasted, replaced by something far more meaningful. 3 months later, Maria accepted a position as Community Outreach Coordinator for the Carrington Foundation, using her experience and connections to bridge the gap between wealthy donors and the communities they served. She continued to live on Jake's property, but in a renovated guest house rather than the garage apartment. Jake found himself attending charity events regularly, not as a social obligation but as a genuine advocate for causes Maria had helped him understand. Their relationship had evolved into something neither had expected, a partnership built on mutual respect and shared values rather than employer and employee dynamics. The Bluebonnet Gala became known as a turning point in Texas charity work, cited as an example of how diversity and authentic inclusion could strengthen organizations and improve outcomes. Several long-standing board members quietly resigned, while new voices brought fresh perspectives and renewed energy to important work. Maria never forgot the lesson of that evening, that dignity and worth weren't determined by others' opinions but by one's own actions and character. She carried herself with the same grace whether scrubbing floors or addressing board meetings, understanding that authentic confidence came from within. The wealthy cowboy and his former maid had indeed brought the house down, but they had built something better in its place, a relationship based on genuine respect and a community more committed to its stated values than its social hierarchies. Years later, when Maria and Jake's relationship had deepened into love and partnership, they would return to the Adolphus Hotel for other events. Maria always remembered to thank the coat check attendant, the servers, and the cleaning staff, understanding that every person deserving of dignity and respect, regardless of their role in the evening's performance. The laughter had not lasted, but the change it sparked endured, rippling through Texas society in ways both subtle and profound, proving that sometimes the most important revolutions begin with a single person refusing to accept that their worth is determined by others' limitations.